Jungle.
Hello everybody. Today we are going to discuss the chief characteristics of the literature written during the Victorian era. In the year 1837, Queen Victoria ascended the throne of Great Britain. She served the empire for a period of 64 years, till her death in 1901. It is one of the longest reigns in the history of England. The period was marked by many important social and historical changes that altered the nation in many ways. The population nearly doubled, the British Empire expanded exponentially, and technological and industrial progress helped Britain become the most powerful country in the world. This period was marked by freedom from wars and internal strife. The calmness of the age made the people lovers of tradition rather than long for revolution or any radical changes in the society or in the politics of the country. While discussing Victorian era or any age for that matter, it should always be kept in mind that all literary periods or movements are really just a scholarly construct to help readers understand and classify literature from different time periods. The literature of this era was preceded by Romanticism and was followed by Modernism or Realism. Hence, it can also be called a fusion of Romantic and Realist styles of writing. One of the chief characteristics of the Victorian era is the shifting worldviews. During the Victorian period, the science was developing in Europe. People were trying to reach to a suitable compromise between science and religion. That's why this period is also known as the Age of Compromise. During the 18th century, religion was at the center of life and society. The rules regarding religion and church were strictly followed. The church authority was very powerful. Galileo had proved that it is the earth that revolves round the sun, not the vice versa. Earlier it was believed that the earth is stable and the sun revolves round the earth. The emerging scientific beliefs, like Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which made people distance themselves from the church, also contributed to the development of the scientific attitude amongst the people of Europe in general and of England in particular. Half of the English population remained the believer of the Christianity and the Bible, and the other half of it now adopted a rational and scientific attitude which had challenged all the Christian way of life, of Christian values, the assurance regarding redemption and salvation. Science brought industrial revolution in the whole Europe. The Industrial Revolution led to the widening of the distance between the haves and have-nots, and many writers felt obligated to speak out against what they believed to be social injustices. The early Victorian works are characterized by attention to social issues such as child labor and poverty. Thus, the literature of this age tends to come closer to daily life, which reflects its practical problems and interests. This was more like the age of pessimism and confusion. The influence of science was strongly felt here. Tennyson's some immature works seem to hold doubtful and despairing strengths, but his In Memoriam comes out as a hope after despair. Although characterized as practical and materialistic, the literature of the Victorian age portrays a completely ideal life. It was an idealistic age where the great ideals like truth, justice, love, brotherhood were emphasized by poets, essayists, and novelists of the age. Victorian literature became a powerful instrument of human progress. Representative works include the beloved novel Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Victorian novels tended to be idealized portraits of difficult lives in which hard work, perseverance, love, and luck win out in the end. There was a bright side also of this material progress. It led to the blossoming of the British Empire. British Empire, it was a very vast area upon the globe. The pride and the national identity peaked during these years. There were also some significant improvements in technology. The Victorian era slightly overlaps with Britain's Industrial Revolution, which saw big changes to the way people lived, the way people worked, the way people traveled, everything, every aspect of their lives. These improvements in technology offered a lot of opportunities for the people in England, but also represented a major upheaval with regard to how people lived their lives and how they interacted with the world. Tennyson, who became the poet laureate in 1850, wrote wonderful lyric poetry. In fact, the Victorian literature seems to deviate from the strict principle of art for art's sake and asserts its moral purpose. Tennyson, Robert Browning, all were the teachers of England with the faith in their moral message to instruct the world. Playwrights like Oscar Wilde and Bernard Shaw were each cleverly iconoclastic in their own ways, satirizing the shortcomings of their society in plays such as The Importance of Being Earnest and Pygmalion. In poetry, Robert Browning's fascinating dramatic monologues foreshadowed the 20th century use of the natural rhythms of speech over the strict metrical arrangements of traditional poetry. In general, the Victorian literature represents a zenith of English language and literary achievements in terms of the beauty of its language and thought, reflecting traditional values and using time-tested literary forms to express it. The focus is on sensory elements. The recurring elements, the recurring themes in the works of this age were the conflict between religion and science, and the belief and the chief interest was in the classical and medieval fables and legends. The reclaiming of the past was a major part of Victorian literature, with an interest in both classical and medieval literature of England. The Victorians loved the heroic, they loved chivalrous stories of the knights of the old, and they hoped to regain some of that noble courtly behavior and impress it upon the people both at home and in the wider empire. The most important and obvious characteristic of the Victorian poetry was the use of sensory elements. Most of the Victorian poets used imagery and the sense of to convey the abstract ideas of the struggle between religion and science, and ideas about nature and romance which transport the readers into the minds of the hearts of the people of the Victorian age, even today. Thus, this period has given a great contribution to the English literature in the forms of novel, essays, critical essays, poetry, and plays as well. However, it is the novels of this period that attracts the readers to read and reread the works of the great writers of the age. No doubt that whenever novel as a literary term is thought about or talked about, the four well-known wheels of novel would come first to our mind that remind the names of great novelists like Samuel Richardson, Lawrence Sterne, Tobias Smollett, Henry Fielding. We find a good chemistry between the reflection of the image of the contemporary age and the creative faculty of the writers with their free expression of the imagination and emotion that touched the readers of all ages and of all age. The Victorian era witnessed an expansion of the novel. It branched off in all directions and embraced all spheres of life, so that there is hardly any recognized category of fiction of which we do not find examples among Victorian novelists. We have domestic novels, historical novels, political novels, mystery novels, crime novels, sociological novels, romantic novels, religious novels, psychological novels, and perhaps some others. A marked feature of the Victorian novel was its use as a vehicle of social criticism. In this field, we have such names as Dickens, Disraeli, and Samuel Butler. From a mere string of episodes for entertainment, such as in Pickwick Papers, the novels gradually developed into something more serious in purpose. It became an instrument of instruction and enlightenment. With the consciousness of purpose came a deep awareness and more philosophic analysis of characters. The novel was no longer a bundle of feelings. Now passion was added to thought. In short, the novel became more intelligent, calculated to appeal to taste and intellect. In form and technique generally, the Victorian novel tended to be huge and sprawling. This was due largely to the fact that a novel in the Victorian period was published in monthly or weekly installments and was issued in 3 volumes. Novels written in such conditions were bound to be loose in construction. The field of Victorian novel is so wild and so crowded that in order to have a sharply defined chart of it in the mind, it is essential to discriminate between the novelists of the first order and those of the second order. It is safe to say that those belonging to the first order are Dickens, Thackeray, George Eliot, Charlotte and Emily Bronte. Now we will discuss Charles Dickens. He was the greatest novelist of that age. He was the most popular one. Dickens was a writer who looked upon familiar things in the light of romance. His sharp and minute observation renders everything, everyday life in its most concrete details, but his poetic imagination invests it with the colors of fantasy. This Dickens land is peopled with imagery, characters that are like household words now. It is often said that his characters are types or humors in the Ben Jonsonian sense, embodiments of some peculiarity to the exclusion of all other qualities. But this is partially true. In fact, his characters are individuals also. Art is never an exact transcript from life. Dickens exaggerates the peculiarities of his characters to the point of caricature, thus making them larger than life and more vital. His characters are touched with poetic fantasy. It is his poetic imagination that distinguishes Dickens from all other novelists. Dickens was a born writer who found in his early career as a journalist just opportunities he needed for the blossoming of his peculiar gifts. He may be said to have reached his peak with David Copperfield. His novels are more distinguished for their moral content than for their literary excellence. Dickens was certainly more keen on putting his message across than on excelling as a stylist. Now let's talk about William Makepeace Thackeray. He was another novelist of the Victorian era. Thackeray's early works are exercises in satirical humor. He attacked on snobbery and on exaltation of criminals in his earlier works. He described himself as a satirical moralist. Being an avowed moralist, he frequently steps aside and delivers a lecture. Objecting to these habits, some critics have criticized him on the ground that just preachings lessen the dramatic force of his characterization. Now, there were Bronte sisters also, who presented forceful novels in that age. The excessive interest in the Brontes shown by the enthusiasts have produced an impression of their importance. The Bronte family had 6 children, 5 daughters, Maria, Elizabeth, Charlotte, Emily, Annie, and a son, Barnwell. Now we will concentrate on Emily and Charlotte Bronte's achievements only. Charlotte Bronte's limitations are obvious. She lacked the imagination necessary for transmitting personal experience into art. The publication of Jane Eyre in 1847 established a dazzling reputation for Charlotte. This novel particularly revolutionized prose fiction by being the first to focus on its protagonist's moral and spiritual development through an intimate first-person narrative, where actions and events are colored by psychological intensity. Charlotte Bronte has been called the first historian of the private consciousness. The novel contains elements of social criticism, with a strong sense of Christian morality at its core, and is considered by many to be ahead of its time because of Jane's individualistic character and the manner the novel approaches the topics of class, religion, and feminism. This is one of the most famous romance novels of all times. Now let's talk about Emily Bronte. Her only novel was Wuthering Heights, which was published in the same year when Jane Eyre was published in 1847. It is a unique novel. If Charlotte Bronte's novels are all autobiography and touched by imagination, Emily Bronte's novel is all imagination and related to life or experience. The result is a nightmare horror dominated by fiery passions of love and hate. The main figure and his actions are too demonic to be human. Later in this period, George Eliot. It was the pen name of Mary Ann Evans. So she published The Mill on the Floss in 1860, and in 1872 her most famous work Middlemarch was published. Like the Brontes, she published under a masculine pseudonym. In the latter decade of the Victorian era, Thomas Hardy was the most important novelist. His works include Under the Greenwood Tree, Far from the Madding Crowd, The Mayor of Casterbridge, Tasse de Bovelis, and Jude the Obscure. Other significant novelists of the era were Elizabeth Gaskell, Anthony Trollope, George Meredith, and George Gissing. Now, let us discuss Victorian poetry. The most important and obvious characteristic of the Victorian poetry was the use of sensory elements. Most of the Victorian poets used imagery and the senses to convey the scenes of struggle between religion and science, and ideas about nature and romance which transport the readers into the minds and hearts of the people of the Victorian age, even today. Another characteristic of Victorian poetry was the sentimentality. Victorian poets wrote about bohemian ideas and furthered the imaginings of romantic poets. Poets like Lord Alfred Tennyson prominently used sentimentality in their poems. His poems were marked by a wide range of topics, from romance to nature to criticism of political and religious institutions. He even did not fail to attack the establishment. His poems, like In Memoriam, dealt with Tennyson's exploration of his feelings of love, his feelings of loss, his feelings of desire. Tennyson was significantly influenced by Romanticism because he was living during a time when the Romantic period also had reached its heights. Tennyson was extremely erudite, and he could claim to his credit a wide breadth of classical learning which also heavily influenced many of his writings. When we analyze Tennyson's poetry, we see a multiple kinds of influences working on his poetry. We find that his divided self gets reflected in it. He is also interested in historical past, the mythological past, his faith in religion, in God, in eternity is quite strong, and it's quite evident throughout his work. But he could also engage with science and religion in a way that it did not really take away his faith in humanity or his faith in religion. He was also interested in nature, and altogether he could be considered as a typical Victorian, which makes it all the more right to make him the most representative figure of the century itself. Tennyson was a prolific writer whose love for nature and romance found expression in beautiful poems, many of which were based on myths and legends of a long past classical era. With this, now we move to the next important figure of that period, Robert Browning, who lived from 1812 till 1889. Here also we find that he dominated the century in almost the same way that Tennyson did. Robert Browning wrote daring and unkempt dramatic monologues that read very well today. He tried to engage with aspects of knowledge, truth, evidence, and faith. The aspect of faith was quite common to most of the writers who were writing during Victorian period. There is also a group of ardent supporters who came up with the Browning cult, who continued to support and continued to celebrate whatever Browning wrote and published. When we talk about the dramatic genius of Browning, it is useful to remember that he almost perfected the aspect of dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologue is something that he continued to write throughout his lifetime. And we find many of the modernist writers experimenting a lot with this technique of dramatic monologue. And many critics also feel that perhaps there was a significant element of dramatic genius built into the poetic abilities of Browning. In many of his poems, we find that Browning had a wonderful capacity to explore the construction of the self. And we also find that his ironic gaze was often directed inwards. Browning was an uncompromising foe of scientific materialism. In that sense, we also find a contrasting trend in him compared to that of Tennyson. He continued to preach God and immorality as the central truth of his philosophy of life. Many of the Victorian poets were interested in mythology, perhaps none more than Swinburne. Victorian age is the first age in which women stand on equal ground, or at least Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Christiana Rossetti should be considered among the top half dozen poets of the Victorian age. Generally, Victorian poetry is formal, but it can be quite innovative within its forms and metrics. Victorian poetry is somewhat more genteel than its earlier romantic influences, less rebellious and less revolutionary. The other important Victorian poets include Robert Browning, Matthew Arnold, Arthur Hugh Claw, George Meredith, William Morris, Dante, Gabriel Rossetti, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Christiana Rossetti, and Algernon Charles Swinburne. I hope you have enjoyed this discussion very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.